Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So tonight we have with us, as almost always, Mala. How you doing, Mala?
Good evening, everyone.
And if this is your first time here, welcome to Shop Talk. The premise of the show is this is basically a way for us to talk a little bit about a variety of topics on various matters. I hope that was specific enough to help elucidate what we do here. Generally what happens is chat says things, they get me to rant about something, and that's how we spend the hour. So baiting Kevin for an hour, it's kind of what we do. But if you have questions, SQL Server, data platform, anything along those lines, drop them in chat, and we're happy to talk about that. Otherwise, we do have a few things on our agenda that we were going to talk about tonight. So, first bit on the docket is a quick update in case you're not familiar. There have been a lot of updates to Azure Data Studio as well as SQL Server Management Studio 19.1. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time. I know, Mala, you've had a chance to use Azure Data Studio a bit more. And also kind of point out that if you haven't used Azure Data Studio since 2020, the product has changed a lot and it's much better than it was. It was a
Mm-hmm.
bad product 3 years ago. It was also a brand new
Mm-hmm.
product 3 years ago. So there has been a considerable amount of improvement, and wanted to give people a little nudge that, well, if you haven't tried it in a while and your primary role is mostly around database development versus at strictly administration, then it might be worth giving it a shot. But Mala, you had some experiences with this, so why don't you talk about how you've been using Azure Data Studio lately?
So I have switched quite a bit to Azure Data Studio, meaning I work about 80% there. The only big thing that I miss about SQL Server Management Studio is access to Query Store, which we use a lot where I work. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm really enjoying it. It took me a while to get used to it because it's a different interface compared to SSMS for sure. Uh, but I learned quite a bit about the things that have changed, and since when Kevin said, a few years ago when it wasn't really that much of an appealing product. Right now, thanks to Erin mostly, they've made a lot of changes to it, and I really like it. I especially like the abilities it has now to work with execution plans, which we do quite a bit. They have their tools added. I thought for some reason Plan Explorer was integrated, but apparently that's not true. But they have something like Plan Explorer. If you open Azure Data Studio and look at the toolbar right now, I have my work thing open. Otherwise, I can share my screen. Let me see if I can close out of my work and connect to my local instance for a second. But they've made a ton of different changes to it. They've enhanced and added a lot of tools that we can use for troubleshooting plans and working with execution plans and stored procedures. If you are doing a lot of that, I highly recommend checking out as a Data Studio because the changes that it has now are very useful and done really well with a lot of thought and you know feedback from users. Of course, I really like it. So, Kevin, while you talk about SSMS, I'm going to, connect to my local instance and then show people what I like about it.
Sure. And so I'm going to drop in a few links from Aaron Stellato, since Mala name dropped Aaron. And these are 3 blog posts that Aaron has written over the course of the last couple of weeks, talking about some of the changes in SQL Server Management Studio 19.1. 19.1 has quite a few new updates. The first blog post that I linked to here covered some updates to like SMO, DACFX, the SQL, Microsoft.data.SQL client. Stuff that's kind of generic interest, but maybe not the most critical notions that we need to, this is going to change your life. Instead, it's more of, yeah, we're keeping things going as we would expect. There were a couple of other changes around trusting server certificates and forcing encryption that we have seen in Azure Data Studio, but haven't seen in Management Studio yet. So that was article number one. Article number two, and actually, oops, let me share my screen here. Let's see if I can share that window. There we go. So here's article number two. This is where I think things get kind of exciting, and that is removing the SQL vulnerability assessment. Maybe not that exciting of its own, but it is gone. If you hated it, it's no longer there. If you didn't know that it was there, you're not missing out on a whole lot. It was kind of a useful tool, but the problem was that it wasn't very comprehensive and didn't always give you great information. So basically, they took it out. Aaron's recommendation, official recommendation, is to use Microsoft Defender for SQL. I will say that there was recently on Curated SQL a post around slow performance in Microsoft Defender for Azure SQL. This is from Ian Evans at X10, and I just got it in today. But basically, this article covers a case where Ian ran into an issue where where Azure Defender for SQL Server had taken up about 12% of total CPU utilization. And as this was a heavy OLTP instance, the higher the throughput, the more Azure Defender for SQL took in terms of CPU utilization, because it was tracking every single session that was open, all of the queries that were being run through. The average should be somewhere around 3%, but in his particular case, it was considerably higher. So as soon as they stopped it, all the resource weights basically dropped down to nothing, and signal weights did remain, but those weren't covered from Defender. So that is a reminder that any sort of antivirus program can have a negative effect on a busy system, and this is where you have to understand the cost versus benefit of what kind of risk am I taking by not scanning certain things, and what kind of risk am I taking by scanning certain things and subsequently having maybe a performance issue that causes a system outage. And if you're on that knife threshold, which in a lot of cases for a cloud, this is where we're trying to push people, is closer to the knife's edge versus having so much spare capacity available that you're able to absorb all of these performance changes over time. Well, if you live closer to the edge, then it's easier to fall off. And that's my metaphor of the day. So back to this article here. Basically, Aaron points out a couple of niceties around, say, versioning. That SSMS versioning will be more consistent between the About menu and other places. Within PowerShell, they will default to use remote signed instead of the default. So you can change the execution policy within your SQL Object Explorer. And then there's a third post that I haven't even read yet, but it has to do with additional changes like always encrypted capabilities, so support for secure enclaves and in-place encryption. SQL Managed Instance has added a network checker so that you can see if there's any sort of network issue between your on-premises server and the Azure SQL Managed Instance in whatever region you're talking about. And you can restore from S3 URLs. So actually that's pretty interesting because you could do that from T-SQL, but now it's available within Management Studio itself. And you'll put in your secret key and access key. So there's a few niceties that are coming up. And Aaron does want to point out, no, we have not deprecated Management Studio, but this is the last 19 release. So Management Studio 20 will be on the agenda. And by the way, that's public. No, I don't know any secret information about Management Studio 20, but basically, we're going to see Management Studio. We're going to see Azure Data Studio. Both tools are going to remain relevant. I mean, I would expect, like I keep joking about, you will tear SQL Server Management Studio from the cold dead hands of tens of thousands of database administrators. That they will go to their retirement using Management Studio. If you take away the tool, they're just going to keep using it. Like, I'm sure that there's some person out there. There's some crusty old person out there still using Enterprise Manager, just like Anders said.
Yeah.
Found a way, finding a way. But so Mala, you had something that you might be able to share.
Yeah, I just want to share some good features about Azure Data Studio that I currently like. So share, renew share screen. Okay, entire screen. Do I select a window? Okay, window makes better sense. All right. Okay, so here we go. You see it?
Yep.
So this is what I do. Those of us who work with stored procedures, if you click on enable actual plan, it will show you the actual plan when it runs. This is for that, and the estimated plan is here, the parse button is here. These things are familiar for us. And then they've added a whole bunch of stuff here. This big toolbar that you have, this is all about working with execution plans. So top operations, think the same thing as what we had with SQL Sentry, Plan Explorer, very similar. So it highlights that, and then the query plan is here, and then you have highlight expensive operation, which is something I really like. So you have, then it gives you a bunch of different stuff on which basis how do you want to classify expensive. Either it is cost or actually elapsed time or blah or anything that you want, and you do this and it will put a red square around whatever is the most. If you have a really large plan, this is very basic. So if you have something like that, it's really useful. And there are multiple metrics that you can choose from: actual number of rows read, subtree cost, all of this stuff. So I like all this. It's really, really helpful when you're working with a lot of different things. A big plan with a lot of stuff that you have to do. Then what else? Then compare execution plans. Now we had this in Query Store, where you could pick two plans that Query Store had and compare. But now as a Data Studio has it on its own. You can just compare this plan, and then you can, if you have some other plan stored, you can just open it and then put it here, and it's going to compare the two plans for you right here. You don't have to go into Query Store for it or have Query Store enabled for it, which might be really helpful to a lot of people. So that is that, and then. Properties is so normal. And then you have the various save as options. um yeah, it's not showing that. I think you have to go down or somewhere. Where did you have it? Had the query. Oh, somewhere. I don't know, for some reason it's not showing me. You can also save your oh, if I do this it will show you that. Yeah, there it is. So you can save your query as a bunch of query results as a bunch of different things, like CSV, Excel. For some other very dumb reason, the older way that displayed without the grid, that thing is not there, and they're working on it for feedback. But there is a multitude of other options that you can use. You can save it as all sorts of things. If you have your developers harassing you for give it to me as an Excel file or give it to me as a CSV, all those things are available right here. You can just say, go run your query and do it yourself. So it even has JSON and a bunch of other stuff too here, save as markdown and all that kind of stuff. So good stuff, a lot of good stuff. And then I did, I don't know if this will, can you see my PowerPoint, Kevin?
No, we're just seeing Azure Data Studio. I think you only shared the window.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. Okay, I'll have to stop it and share then. Stop it and
So
then.
while Mala's doing that, I'm going to say that I still use SQL Sentry Plan Explorer for any
Uh-huh.
sort of detailed query plan
Mm-hmm.
analysis. I've been using that long enough, know how to operate it, and it picks up issues, I think, even quicker.
Mm-hmm.
But that the execution plan viewer in Azure Data Studio is considerably better than it was 6 months ago. This took it from being kind of a joke to being at least reasonable. I think it's at least on par with Management Studio. I don't know that it's better than what's in Management Studio, but I think it's uh, gotten to the point where they're close enough.
So this is the list of things I made from what Erin's talk at SQL Bits on the things that I am going to like and use on an everyday basis. I can't demo everything here because it's going to take up a good amount of time, but I have listed it here and I'll cut and paste this in the chat panel for those who want to go and play with it. Oh, did I say autosave? This is also one of the things I really, really like. If you turn on autosave, it keeps saving whatever you're working on its own very quickly and awesome, pretty awesome. I don't think SSMS has that, and although it is really good at bringing back the stuff you lost in case you had to close out, having autosave is very, very helpful. And then the control slash comment and uncomment blocks. So this is a key, key combo that's also very helpful. Then control space gives you intelligence, and then they have some options like if you type a select star on a really big table and you want it to expand all the column list, it can do that. If you highlight that star and click control space, then it's going to expand the whole thing on its own. So that sort of stuff, a lot of cool stuff. And the color themes too, there are some really good color themes that are helpful for people who want it a specific way and that sort of stuff. You don't have all that in SSMS. So nice stuff. I'll paste it in the chat panel. And that's it.
Great. Yeah. So, long story short, I mean, okay, so I did not plan to wear the Azure Data Studio T-shirt. It just kind of came out this way. So the shilling is entirely free and organic. There was nobody asking either of us, hey, talk about Azure Data Studio. But I think actually it came out of some chat with Mala where she was saying, hey, I'm using this thing a lot more than I have before, and it's not that bad. It's not as much like pulling fingernails as you might be led to believe. And frankly, a lot of that is, I've been using this tool forever. Why do I have to use something else? And use the tool for 6-8 months and you find out, oh, yeah, actually, this isn't too bad. And Management Studio is still a good tool. I consider it still very high. I have a very high level of respect for it as an administration tool. And if Azure Data Studio did not exist, I'd have no problem using SSMS. By the way, one of the big things of 19.1, startup time is considerably faster than it was in 19.0 and in 18. So in that case, you can get past the splash screen much faster than you have in the past few versions of SSMS, which that alone may be enough to make you want to upgrade. Change is bad. Anders, I agree.
I think also that it's looking more, of a thing now that Azure Data Studio is developer oriented versus SSMS, which is more DBA oriented. That is making a little bit more sense now with all these new features than it used to. We are a sort of a unique shop where I work, where Kevin used to work, but most shops, I can understand why they would ask a developer to work with, or they would think a developer would work better with Azure Data Studio now compared to SSMS.
Yeah. And, Anders mentions, hey, 90% of what I do is admin, so it's not worth switching over. That's fair.
Yeah, that's fair. That's what I said. Yeah,
right.
that's fair. Yeah.
Not to put words into Erin's mouth, considering that she's not here and has no idea that we're talking about this, but SSMS is not going away. It is there. It is a good tool that has been built out over 18 years. It is old enough to vote, smoke, and depending on the country, drink. So it's been around for a long time. It's got a lot of stuff in there. Some of that stuff is good. Some of that stuff is not so good. That it's kind of just hung around forever because, it would be more effort to take it out of the product. But despite collecting some cruft over the years, it's still a really good product. And if you are primarily database administration focused, SSMS is a better tool than Azure Data Studio.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting closer to the point, though, or it is at the point, I think, where this is like Visual Studio versus VS Code,
Mm-hmm.
where if you live in .NET backend work, you do C Sharp or F Sharp all day, this is all that you do, Visual Studio is still a better product. If you do front end work, Visual Studio Code is a better product. And
Mm-hmm.
Visual Studio Code has become incredibly popular cross platform.
I use it for PowerShell.
Yeah. I mean, it's to the
Yeah.
point where I think my understanding is VS Code is by far the largest used IDE in the world now. And it's not that old of a product. It's only, what, 6 years old or so?
Mm-hmm.
I'm spitballing the year. I don't remember. I thought it came out somewhere around 2017. But basically, VS Code hasn't been around that long, and it has become an incredibly well used IDE. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, there are still places where Visual Studio is a better option.
Mm-hmm.
There are still places where Management Studio is a better option. Now, VS Code and Azure Data Studio, considering it's based off of the VS Code shell, are
Mm-hmm.
going to provide a benefit in terms of extensibility. It is a lot easier to build an extension for VS Code or for Azure Data Studio than it is to
Mm-hmm.
build one for Visual Studio or for SSMS, which is itself based on the Visual Studio shell.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we see a lot of extensions come out for Azure Data Studio. Some of them are pretty small, pretty easy. Some of them are much larger, more all encompassing, like Ionide in VS Code that basically allows you to run .NET and especially F Sharp code. That's a huge project where they took an IDE that wasn't intended to run .NET because originally VS Code people were like, well, why do you need to run C Sharp or F Sharp? I mean, you just use Visual Studio for that. And community projects eventually came out to support C Sharp, F Sharp, and other .NET languages, PowerShell, like Mala mentioned. You get that support in the IDE because of these extensions, and the extensibility is just it was planned in from the beginning that it's not just the Microsoft developers who are going to make this product work. It's going to be a community-driven effort as well. There's a lot less in terms of Azure Data Studio projects extensions, although many VS Code extensions will work in Azure Data Studio.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the stuff for niceties, skinning for that kind of stuff will still work on Azure Data Studio. You just have to import the
Erin
extension
had
file.
some reason why they had two products, Kevin. I forget why. Because we asked in her class, why is there Visual Studio Code? They're basically the same product, right? In a way. So why is there two versions? The only reason I could think of is that Visual Studio Code is very bare bones. Uh, it's a no frills, very basic kind of product, while Azure Data Studio has all these plugins and extensions and all of that.
The main reason why there are two products, so Azure Data Studio is built off of VS Code. It uses VS
Yeah.
Code as the core, and if
Right.
you look at the GitHub project, you'll see regular merges from VS Code into Azure Data Studio.
Uh-huh.
So the reason that it's a separate product is because these are different project teams working on it. VS Code has its own product teams at Microsoft. Azure
Mm.
Data Studio is owned by the SQL Server tools team.
Mm.
And that's why that it's easier. Okay, this is where I'm now speaking as an outsider. My not even understanding. My expectation gotta set the level appropriately. My expectation is large company politics. This product team owns this product. This other product team benefits from the product. We're going to not try to merge the two together because they're completely different org chain or elements of the org chain. So we don't want to try to merge the SQL tools with Visual Studio Code teams because that doesn't make sense. And we don't want the VS Code developers to get pulled in on this, what they would consider probably like a side project. So instead, the funding comes from different parts of the organization, the developers come from different parts of the organization, and that's why they're just different projects.
Mm-hmm.
That would be, if I were to create a Just So story, that's how I would tell that story.
Mm.
And the best part is it might actually be true.
Given Microsoft, I'm not surprised at it.
Yeah, I mean, that's endemic to any large enough company. So you have any organization sufficiently large, there will be political infighting, there will be turf wars, there will be understandings that, it's just better if I build my own thing over here and you build your own thing over there. And maybe my thing is
Mm-hmm.
based on your thing, but at that point, I'm now a consumer of whatever it is you're producing. And we work from there instead of trying to merge everything together.
Mm.
It's just like why SQL Server Management Studio has been built on the Visual Studio shell for the last, decade? I think
Mm.
SSMS 2012 was the first one that was actually based on the Visual Studio shell.
Mm.
And so it's been based on that shell for a decade. Well, it's not part of Visual Studio. It doesn't really make sense to try to bring that into Visual Studio.
Mm.
This is like VI versus Emacs. It's definitely a lot more low key than that because
Mm.
VI versus Emacs, you can get people thrown out of bars for that. Um, that's, that's proper religious differences there. Whereas VS versus VS Code, I don't know too many people who say I love Visual Studio and VS Code is garbage. I know a lot of people who say I love VS Code and I don't use Visual Studio because it doesn't do what I need it to do, or because I don't want to pay for it, or whatever reason. I've got no ability to install that heavier weight software. So, I know people who have sniped at Visual Studio from a VS Code perch, but not so much in the other direction. Usually it's more like, okay, cool, whatever. I'm just going to use Visual Studio because it's what I do.
Mm-hmm.
Or for people who have both of them and they say, yeah, no, I like Visual Studio because it has better integration with .NET. But I like
Mm-hmm.
VS Code so that I can write React or whatever JavaScript framework of the month we're working with today.
Mm-hmm.
So it is definitely a little bit more laid back. Now, speaking of laid back, I'm gonna share again, and this time we're gonna talk about. This is an article that Anders pointed out, so you can go ahead and blame Anders for us talking about this. AI feedback loop. So the article from VentureBeat basically says that here. Let me drop the link in. Yeah, that would be a first. I know. Next up, you're gonna lead me on a rant or something. It's weird. Um, so this article. Whoops. Let me fix that. I tried to move the chat just a little bit like this so that Mala's head's not getting blocked, and then I took everything with me. All right. Brief summary of the article. Essentially, what it's talking about is that you have models that are trained on a broad variety of internet-based data. So you pull in books, you pull in articles, photographs, wiki pages, you pull in all these different websites, all these different news articles for 150 years that are electronically organized. And you train a large language model or you train a image generation model, whatever sort of generative AI model that you're developing, you build this thing out and you train it. Then it starts generating a whole bunch of stuff, whole bunch of outputs. Well, the problem is that there is a negative feedback loop when the model that is generating outputs, knowing that this is not a truth model, as I'm eventually going to get a T-shirt that says large language models are not truth models.
Hmm.
There will be a dozen people who understand, but you know what? There are dozens of us. Nonetheless, you're generating all this output. This output may or may not have any sort of truth value. So, sort of like Slashdot. I would have said Reddit, except they've already shut themselves down. So you have this model that basically has generated a whole bunch of stuff, and when you train it on the stuff that it generated out, instead of fine tuning or getting better, what happens is that the products actually get worse. Retraining ends up generating, here we go, model collapse, where you forget the underlying data distribution because you've essentially generated your own new data distribution and you're training off of that data that you've generated, which in certain circumstances can work reasonably well, but most this is a knife edge process. Basically, if something goes slightly wrong, model quality collapses. And here's a quotation from one of the authors that over time, mistakes in generated data compound and ultimately force models that learn from generated data to misperceive reality even further. You're getting worse and worse results. And because you're the generator of so much of this information, you're generating new bad information to train yourself on and telling yourself that this is perfectly fine. And so essentially, there is a risk with this sort of training that if you don't filter out a lot of the garbage that is generated by the models themselves, then you can end up with a feedback loop of negative consequences. And so I do also want to mention Ross Anderson. I want to name drop Ross Anderson because here, let me go grab the book. Because Ross Anderson has my favorite book on security engineering.
Oh my, what a book to read, Kevin. Oh
Yeah,
my.
I ended up reading about 80% of it. Now there's some stuff that I skimmed through. Most of the cryptography stuff I skimmed through because I don't have a PhD. So that is actually a graduate level textbook, but it's really
Oh,
well
it's a
written.
textbook, okay.
Yeah, it's extremely well written, very well done. This was I forget what year it came out, but it was probably in the 2012 range. So I'm sure that there's the third or a fourth edition by this point. And he is one of the authors of the paper, basically indicating that, well, the all of this AI generated output will have a risk of generating worse output over time. Also, if you really want doom scrolling, my second article is this is actually an article from about 2 years ago. So this is not really doom scrolling in the sense of, oh, let's talk about all these bad things that could possibly happen. This is more of here's the cost of actually training these models, and drop the link in chat there. This is IEEE Spectrum. The authors essentially point out that deep learning models, so neural networks, have become extremely popular for a wide variety of tasks. They turn out to do a really good job on a lot of different problems. However, there's a problem with them. And the problem with them is that you hit a quality wall. So let me scroll down to where the article gets to. Here we go. Essentially, we see error percentages of error, and the model quality has improved over time, but this is with enormous increases in computational capacity. So if you want to improve performance by a factor of k, then you need at least k squared more data points to train the model. And for computational cost, you have at least k to the fourth power. So for tenfold improvement in terms of model accuracy, you need 10,000 fold the increase in computation. There have been some significant advances in computational capacity, which is how neural networks became a rather viable option about a decade ago. So the new Intel quantum computer comes out just in time. I I will bite my tongue on quantum mostly because I know and respect certain people who are deeply tied into quantum, who know a whole lot more than I do and actually believe in it. I'm not a big quantum believer, but I also understand that I know very little about it, and therefore know that I shouldn't say too much. But I, a lot of what people are selling as quantum computers today either are not quantum computers, but are just marketed as such, or they actually are quantum computers, and you're talking 10 to 30 or 40 qubits. So basically, great, I can handle a few bytes worth of information. Okay, like, call me 50 years from now when that's viable. If it's ever viable. I have my questions about that. The new Iranian one looks great. I don't even know about that, and my automatic reaction is But oh no, I'm not even gonna make that joke. I was gonna make a risque joke about Iranian quantum computers and nuclear plants, but I'm not gonna make that. So let's continue talking about this k to the fourth cost of improvement, because it turns out that in practice, k to the fourth is an understatement, and in reality, it's more like k to the ninth, because to cut the error rate in half, you need 500 times the computational resources. So that's about k to the ninth power, at least k to the eighth. And there's a lot involved in this. Now, the authors do mention, hey, there are algorithmic improvements that can greatly improve the efficiency of deep learning. So it's not like this is dead letter. This is we've milked it as far as we can go. But it is the reason why we have seen a bit of a slowdown in terms of, oh, well, we'll use deep learning to solve this problem and this problem and all these problems. We have seen a little bit of modesty return to some of these companies, some of these organizations, some of these authors who have realized that they can't just say, oh, well, I'm just going to create a new type of neural network and that's going to solve everything, and write a paper and then have it solve everything. And then 5 years later, you find out, oh, it really hasn't solved everything because your paper was outlandish.
Mm-hmm.
Most of that we're saving for generative AI, because that's where all of the claims of miraculous outcomes and we're going to use Chat GPT to find security problems. Yet a new AI company just raised $140 million with no product, and that was the seed round, as I recall. That's absurd. This, by the way, I think this is, we have a lot of money we need to park someplace. Crypto collapsed in terms of being a viable option for companies with more money than sense, and therefore they needed to find someplace else. Well, hey, where else do we need a whole lot of GPUs to do anything meaningful? let's build an AI product. Um, I for one welcome the third AI winter. No, I really don't, but it's gonna happen.
Oh, it's not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, it's not, and it's not one word, right, Kevin? I mean, AI in general has been around for a while. I think LLMs have suddenly made it look like it was born yesterday or something.
Yeah, that's a lot of that is just marketing hype. Um,
Yeah.
you're right. Artificial intelligence. I mean, artificial intelligence as a concept has been with us for a good, well, depending on how you define artificial intelligence. Like, hey, the golem, or golem, depending on how you want to pronounce that. But when you get past fantastical stories and into what we might call practical application, practical concept, you're at least talking about the 1930s and 40s for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the math behind the product, and the 50s
Mm-hmm.
for most of the practical, here's how we can do it.
Mm-hmm.
But there have been two AI winters already, including one that people don't think too much about,
Mm-hmm.
where basically you had a whole lot of funding, a whole lot of push for the premise, and then when it didn't work out the way that people expected, that
Mm-hmm.
funding dried up, and the professors went into hibernation for a couple decades. I went to school during the second AI winter, and there were obviously AI classes. There was talk of AI. There were AI driven concepts and products, but it wasn't something that a lot of companies put at the forefront. That, oh yeah, we're an app for parking, but you know what? It's AI driven parking.
Mm-hmm.
And you ask, how is this different from regular parking? And the answer is that in regular parking, we get a factor of like 2x in terms of funding, whereas AI driven parking, we get a factor of 5x. So we get a lot more money by saying it's an AI driven product
Mm-hmm.
and can BS our way around. Here's how we can make AI driven parking assignments, and we'll use deep learning and generative AI to come up with the best signage for your parking spot.
Hmm.
And obviously, I'm being hyperbolic, but we're seeing a lot of this. We're seeing a lot of companies that are that have more, like I said, more dollars than cents floating around. They need to park their cash somewhere. They want to get their 10x someplace, and this is the hype zone of the day. Give it 3 years, there will still be large language models. There will still be generative AI. I think
Right.
there is viable use for it, but
Uh-huh.
it's about 2% of what people think the viable use is today.
Hmm.
And my general philosophy is always take the under when it comes to new technologies,
Mm-hmm.
because we're going through that hype cycle. It's like a roller coaster. We're on the upswing. We're getting dragged up to the top, and then it's going to fall down because people will realize it's not going to do everything you think it's going to do.
Clearly
And
not.
it will be very expensive to fix. It will be very expensive to improve. There was an anecdote in here in this article about how OpenAI, when they released ChatGPT 3, they said, "Oh, by the way, there's some issues with it that we're aware of, but we're not going to fix them because it would cost too much to retrain." This
Mm-hmm.
goes in with what the article is talking about, that the cost of training is enormous, and small reductions in error rate end up getting a lot more expensive over time. Combine that
Mm-hmm.
with the article that Anders had, and you see some of the difficulty in terms of getting quality data, making sure that the data remains high quality, uh, training your model, maintaining your model, and improving it takes a whole lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of energy. And so, Molly,
That's
you've got a link here to a YouTube video.
no, that's for people who are interested in a philosophical take, non technical take on what AI, and I like to understand what lay people think with any technology. So I watch all these programs, and that is a great philosopher, and it's really philosopher. You will know her, Harari, who I follow, brilliant mind, talking about what he thinks about kids growing up with bots and various social fallout of what can happen with AI. He's not referring to large language models or anything like that. He's just talking of automating a number of things, especially bot based interaction that people have, and where that's going to be taking us. So it's an interesting discussion to watch
Okay.
for those who like that kind of stuff. And there was also the discussion from Stanford with the artistic community on their take on where they think it's going. They're very worried about LLMs stealing their work, and to train the models and such. And but the part about that I found fascinating was, is is artistic work really what you can call data? Is it really? Can you just pixelize it and say this is data that you have to train your machines on? They think it deserves more respect than that term, and I think that there is some validity there. Although I'm not sure if that's going to hold up in court or any such thing. But yeah, it is interesting for sure. I'm still going through the list of the many videos that discussion had. Let me see if we can find it and post it here. But yeah, I mean, we have an interesting future ahead with all this for sure.
Yeah, and there are some interesting legal consequences that I expect to see out of this. I know
Yeah,
Mal and I have offline talked a little bit about this, and
right.
getting a feeling for, based on U.S. case law, based on prior precedent, what the most likely outcomes look like. But
Yeah.
rule number one of court is, never trust the judge to go the way that you want the judge to go. Don't put your faith in the court system.
Yeah.
It may work out the way you want it to. It may work out the way you expect it to, but there's no guarantee of that.
Yeah.
So I think that could be a good topic of discussion for someday in the future.
Yeah.
One of these
So
days,
I'll
maybe.
I'll make some points when I finish this, Kevin, and we can talk about it maybe in some other show.
Yeah, yeah. One click to buy. Right, Anders. That's a really good example of that was, if I remember right, that was East Texas. East Texas for a long time was a district where if you were a company with some shady patent ideas or trademark ideas, you went to East Texas to get litigated because the judges would almost always side with you. And so that's also where a lot of the patent trolling would happen. Um, yeah, this is an area where I I have to reach out and see if I know any lawyers who are willing to speculate, um, and talk a
That
little bit.
Stanford discussion has a lot of lawyers participating, Kevin.
Okay, so check
But
those
it's a
out.
lot of videos. It's going to take a while to get through.
Oh, for sure, it's definitely going to take decades for all of this to wind its way through.
Hmm.
Ask ChatGPT. Yeah, like that one lawyer. Um, by the way, rule number two of lawyering is, never make the judge angry. The judge,
I like that thing link that you post on the chat about something he found and he presented that to the judge. How stupid can a person be? I don't know.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
That's for people who don't know. There in the U.S. there was a court case not too long ago where a lawyer had. Let me see if I can find it because I actually couldn't believe how
So
dumb it
immigrants
is.
have another line to that is never joke with people at immigration. Never get terribly funny or jokesy about anything that they're asking you.
Um,
And people don't know that. A lot of people don't know that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So okay, Mata versus Avianca Inc. They file a brief citing cases fabricated by ChatGPT. The court says, okay, we've never heard of these opinions. File some copies of them. And they go back to ChatGPT and ask it to write the opinions. And then they file the opinions. The Uh, and apparently none of these opinions actually existed, and the lawyer got some.
Honestly, how stupid does one get?
I I'm wondering if it's stupidity. Actually, Simon Wilson here uh, kind of hits on the bit. Getting ChatGPT to hallucinate a full description of a fictional legal case multiple times without it dropping any hints that they are not real is actually kind of difficult. It's possible, but most likely this was, well, we need something, and we're just going to use ChatGPT to generate something. And I mean, the judge isn't even going to look. It turns out the judge looked, and so a little bit of a mess here in terms of all of the silliness. Um, but I do recommend make my opinion sound legal-ish. I do recommend checking out that article. It's a fun article, and apparently it may not be the only incident. A partner at a big law firm who's received memos with fake case sites from at least two different associates. Two attorneys at my firm had opposing counsel file chat GPT briefs with fake cases in the past week. So this is apparently a thing that is happening more often. Don't do that. If you're a lawyer and you're listening to Shop Talk, reach out, because I want to talk to you about legal matters of what that future may look like for generative AI. But also don't do that. Some paralegal at $15 an hour having a good chuckle at the lawyers. If so, that's a real bad paralegal. I know paralegals get the short end of the stick a lot of times, but they're critical to making the lawyers sound good. So our last thing I want to talk about. This actually relates to a training that I'm helping deliver privately tomorrow and Wednesday. But the article itself was so interesting that I thought I'm going to talk about this on Shop Talk. And the secret plot to steal a Coca-Cola formula. And so this is lady Shannon Yo, and she was being laid off from Coca-Cola. She was a chemical engineer, and basically a chemist in her mid-50s being laid off. Now, she had decided that she was going to steal some formulas, but not for the drink itself. Let's be real here. The formula for Coca-Cola itself, I'm sure it's worth money, but it's probably not worth that much money. It's easy enough to make a cola. There are a lot of colas in this planet. The formula that she was actually stealing was a liner formula. So for the aluminum can, there is an extremely thin lining that prevents the acidic beverage from eating through the aluminum in the can. And this lining has to be non-interactive with the drink itself. So you can have a can sitting for months and it's not going to be affected by the lining. There was a previous lining, BPA, which kind of had a problem where if you let the thing sit for long enough, it could affect. And we saw that like with plastic bottles for water, where if you let the bottle sit for long enough, it picks up the taste of the plastic. That was especially true with BPA plastic. So this lining on the cans, this is a thing that she stole. Coca-Cola doesn't even produce the cans. They essentially have the formula that comes from a paint and coating company that is its partner that helps line those cans. So the angle that I wanted to use to talk about this on Shop Talk was actually kind of interesting about how she did it, and the fact that thanks to court cases and some data loss prevention software, we have a pretty good idea of what she did and when. So the night before she gets laid off, she plugs in a Western Digital hard drive into a USB port on a computer, and then tried to move files onto a drive from a folder that was based on the Canliner class. So she's trying to copy these files over to her personal Western Digital hard drive. She was flagged on the internal network. That transfer was blocked because she was being laid off. Interesting story there. If she wasn't being laid off, but had still decided, I want to commit some corporate espionage, would this have picked up on it? And I've worked at companies where they blocked USB ports, like they shut the stuff off entirely. I've known companies where they hot glue the USB ports so that you can't stick a device in. Yeah, steal stuff before you quit or are laid off. Right. Plan your theft well in advance. That's the shop talk way. So anyhow, a pop-up on her screen reminded her that any file transfers off her work computer should go through a cloud storage account the company has set up with Box. So it has to go through your Box account. Well, then 6 minutes later, she plugs in a different hard drive. 7 o'clock, she plugs in the original Western Digital hard drive back, but rather than drag and drop, she opened up Microsoft Excel and tried saving them onto external drive. Quick note, apparently these incredibly super secrets are in Excel files, because of course they are. All sensitive information is in Excel files. She tried the same thing with Microsoft Word, so trying to save some Word docs. And then on August 25th, so actually this was a little bit earlier than the day before she was laid off, but she used her phone to take a series of photos of her work computer monitor, which is difficult to capture with data loss prevention. You don't know that somebody's taking photographs. So if they're working remotely, that's an avenue where, I'm thinking about this as a data professional. Could I stop an insider from just taking those photographs? And unless you're talking about you're in a skiff, you're in a room where they take your phones away from you before you walk in, I don't know that there is a viable defense. This is where things like always encrypted can be useful, like where the database administrator doesn't have access to the data itself. And so selecting star from a table and then trying to take a photograph of that table wouldn't work because you just get the encrypted binary. In Shannon Yo's case, she was legitimately authorized to access this information. So she was one of the chemists. She was apparently one of 2 chemists who had the authority to see the sensitive information from the partner company. And so even that wouldn't block it because she was authorized to view this information. But eventually she was able to upload several encrypted files to a personal Google Drive account. Somehow, Coke's information security system let that through. And then she figured out, oh, well, this worked, and then did it some more. And what she was doing, the story behind this was, what she was doing this for was getting a grant from the Chinese government to set up a competing lining company. And along the way, she ended up working for 2 other companies for the purpose of stealing some secrets from them in the hopes of trying to get a manufactory up and running. She's in prison now, explaining to everybody that no, the government actually is just cracking down on her specifically because of reasons, and that all of this stuff that she was supposedly accused of was all lies. She's in prison. So wait, they actually let this person work after giving the notice of being laid off. Yeah. And that's apparently they turned up the data loss prevention software and said, well, I don't want to see weird behavior, but they let this stuff through. Apparently they had a flaw. Usually a person with that kind of access would be paid to stay home for that period. Oftentimes, yes. And have their laptop taken away and have all devices taken. Just basically, here's your golden parachute and severance. Get out of here. So there's a much longer story in here, but I do find it interesting. It is, as you can see, it's a long read. I thought it was a really good story, and also a thing to think about. As you know, if we're data professionals and our job is to try to prevent this sort of data loss, this is a challenge. This is a real challenge because insider threats are always the hardest to mitigate, and when they have legitimate data access, this wasn't finding a way to steal somebody's credentials or to sneak onto a network share where some information was incorrectly published. This is, I have the access to this information, which is very sensitive, and how do we prevent this person from misusing their access? And that's the story I want to leave you on, because I don't have any great answers. I have mediocre answers, but no great ones. So wanted to leave you on that and say we're gonna people suck. Yeah, that's a good summary. But we're gonna wrap things
People
up for this
certainly
evening.
suck. Yeah.
Yep. But we're gonna wrap things up for this evening, and remember tomorrow in person, Tracy is gonna talk to us about DBA checks. So speaking of security, she helped implement a series of security checks in DBA checks. So that's going to be our topic of the evening. If you're in person in the Raleigh-Durham area, then come check us out. If you're online, it will be hybrid. So this same channel, twitch.tv/triangle_SSUG, or go to meetup.com/tripass and get all the details. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. If we don't, next Tuesday is our data science and business intelligence meeting. So we've got that lined up. Again, meetup.com/tripass. And until we see each other again, everyone, take care.